Not the Harlem Shuffle, but we are going to party like it's 1992. Okay, thank you. That was, of course, The House of Pain from 1992. Could have gone for so many different songs, but hey, wound up with that one. Don't ask me why. It's a long story, and yeah, it goes back to 1992. Anyway, hello the world. Hello, Jason Isaacs. Hello, people who are interested in the politics of 1992. This is all about the voting behaviour and why we wound up with a 21-seat Conservative majority when most of the so-called smart money was going on a Conservative victory, or at least certainly that's what Neil Kinnock thought, judging by the infamous Sheffield Rally. Anyway, these two articles here are going to help you make a lot more sense of this presentation, and hopefully this presentation will help you make a lot more sense of these two articles, and I'll link off to them in the comments section at the back. I'm going to constantly refer back to the data from the Heath, Jowl and Curtis information. That's going to give you a lot of hard evidence with which to support your arguments. But let's push on and have a look at where we were. So this is the outcome in 1992, a majority of 21. Not that great, down from the majority of well over 100 from 87, but certainly at least 21 more than most people were expecting. The voting patterns look a bit like that. Very, very few for Lib Dem and even fewer for the others. Lib Dems pulled about 6 million votes. They did okay. They got about 6 million votes. There you go. But we can see here there's massive concentration at the top, and a dribble down there, a little bit there for the Scottish Nationalists. But really, this is the last of the big elections. The elections building up to this time were around about the 70% mark, but we haven't got close to this for a long, long time. This was a huge election turnout, certainly relative to recent elections. And very, very narrow majority. I can't remember the last time anyone polled that many votes to get that small a majority. But huge turnout and very much unexpected. And what we're going to try to do now is explain why it was that the Conservatives won this particular election. So let's set out the battlefield. And the battlefield was a confluence of short-term and long-term features, long-term forces, features and trends. So in the short term, we've got the Conservative leadership change. We had 11 odd years of Thatcherism, and now we had John Major. And that was significant for the Tories. It was also very significant for the Labour Party, because for the last 11 years they'd been defining themselves as the antithesis of Thatcher, and so that replacement of leadership gave them it put them in a bit of a flat spin, to be honest, because now they didn't know exactly what they were fighting against. There was also an economic recession, certainly not anything like we had in 2008. But it wasn't pleasant for those of us who were coming out of university back in 91, 92, and struggling to work out what we were going to do with the rest of our lives. Yes, a bit of a recession there, not as bad as what was to come for John Major, as Sterling left the ERM in September 92, if I remember correctly. But certainly not a barrel of laughs. Labour had moved to the centre. If you've been watching my other presentations, you'll know that during the 1980s, Labour lurched massively towards the left of the political spectrum, cut free of the sensible ballast that went off to form the SDP. The Labour Party drifted way left in an attempt to shore up its core base. But in the last, certainly after the defeat of Militant in the second half of the 80s, Kinnock had been able to drag the party towards the centre, although it was still certainly well to the left of the Conservatives. So the long-term things we've got to talk about, Thatcherite reforms, and I'd like to talk about that in terms of two particular ideas. First of all being the increased ownership of capital through the sale of council houses and state assets, and also the changes in the class structure brought about by the decline of traditional manufacturing jobs and, of course, the mines. And that had a profound effect in terms of demographics and class movement, and we'll come to look at that a little bit later on. So that class realignment was made worse by the fact that Labour had lurched so horrifically to the left. That alienated a lot of their core voters and left them kind of uncertain as to what the Labour Party actually stood for. And that old thing about, a reputation being built over years and lost in minutes, I think that's to a large extent what happened to the Labour Party between 83 and 87, or even between 79 and 87. And Kinnock had to work hard to try to reposition the party, but critically, while it still had some of the trappings of a more moderate party, there was still Clause 4, and of course Clause 4 committed the Labour Party to the collective ownership of the means of production, which is a sort of central tenet of socialism. So we did have a Labour Party in a state of flux. We had society in a state of flux, and that meant that things were much, much more uncertain, I think, than many people thought going into this particular election. We need to talk about the leadership of the two parties. We have John Major on one hand, who was seen as, on one hand, dull, but on the other hand, reliable and experienced. He'd been Foreign Secretary and he'd been Chancellor. He had had cabinet positions. He had demonstrated a fair amount of political nous in that process, not least because he dragged himself up in spite of not being establishment. He didn't, not only was he not Oxford, he didn't actually go to university. And the joke that went around, that was knocking around at the time, was that this was the man who ran away from the circus to become an accountant. That's not strictly true, but it was very much in the vein of the opinion that a lot of people had of John Major, that he wasn't part of the elite, he wasn't part of the establishment. And that was helped by the fact that he was perceived as not being Thatcher. That might seem a little bit odd, but that meant that he didn't define himself by being not Thatcher, which is rather what Kinnock had got himself into. And as a result of that, he could appeal quite broadly across the political spectrum. He could appeal to Tories who were obviously conservative anyway, but having come from such humble roots and being prepared to play a humble card, he could present quite a wide range of appeal. Perhaps something that Mr. Kinnock, on the other hand, couldn't do. He was charismatic, certainly, he could hold a crowd, but he was untested. He'd been battered by Labour's civil strife, but he'd never really had a cabinet post. So that really counted against him in the public mind. And in the same sense, he was divisive. Now, remember that he had defined himself by opposition to Thatcher, and as a result of that, he was never going to get the votes from any Conservatives. And it was not immediately clear how he was going to try to compensate for that. He had defined himself by being anti-Thatcher, thereby he had established himself as a divisive figure, and that counted against him, particularly relative to the more unifying front, if you like, that Major could offer. So, according to our pals Heath, Jowl and Curtis, they said that this is basically a score draw. The appeal of Major, funnily enough, was probably higher than Kinnock, but that's maybe a 1 percentage point of the Tory vote. So a significant point, but perhaps not a material point. Now let's have a little bit of a look at the campaign. The Conservative campaign was Project Fear. It was predicated on tax, and the campaign started the day after a massive budget giveaway, and they just pounded that afterwards. We had heavy negative campaigning, not much really about what the Conservatives could do, but more about what was going to happen if Labour got in. And yes, it was a sort of draft run of the Project Fear campaign that ran, well, it's pretty much run every election ever since. Two particular things there we look at later: Labour's tax bombshell and the infamous double whammy. No one knew what a double whammy really was, but we were told by Saatchi and Saatchi. And again, preying on the fact that he was not Thatcher, this was John Major taking a soapbox quite literally to the to street corners and standing on that and making a big thing of being a man of the people, again not part of the establishment, which he played that card incredibly hard and incredibly well, particularly in a party political broadcast called The Journey. I'll try to remember to link off to that at the back of that. It's quite an interesting little thing, and well, hopefully you'll have a chance to have a look at that in your own time. Labour, on the other hand, they were talking about a shift to the centre. Now, this was nowhere near as radical as the manifestos that were presented in 83 and 87, but, and it was no longer committed to unilateral disarmament or nationalisation, as you can read for yourselves, but it still had Clause 4. It still had Clause 4 there that committed itself to the workers owning the means of production. And while that perhaps is not something that was the topic of conversation in every pub and club up and down the country. It was still there, and people were aware that Labour had not yet transformed into a full party of the city, of the centre. And certainly the establishment and the financial services were very wary of what Labour might have represented. In terms of policies, well, they were pretty upfront. They said they're going to raise tax, and they were going to raise child benefit, and they were going to plough a huge amount of money into the NHS. But then that got consumed by the infamous Battle of Jennifer's Ear, and that's something you're going to have to look up in your own time, because there's no way I can do that within 15 minutes. The Sheffield Rally, obviously infamous, a moment of dreadful hubris. Whether or not that swung a few votes, well, Curtis and Heath and Charles say probably a couple of points. But not, again, we can't explain the whole victory simply in terms of the actual campaign. There was something else that was at work. And it wasn't just the media. Popular wisdom was that the Sun won it, and we all know about that particular thing. And we all know about Labour's tax bombshell and Labour's double whammy. Now, these were effective campaigns, there's no doubt about it. But according to Heath, Joel and Curtis, again, it's just a percentage point here, a percentage point there. So while the Sun was very pleased that it won it, I think there we have a key example of the correlation of, or the confusion of the confusion of cause and correlation, excuse me. So in terms of short-term factors, we can say that this was a score draw. They rather cancelled each other out. Nothing really worth more than 1% here or there. Individually, nothing sufficient to change the result, and nothing that was definitely necessary. So the short-term factors is one thing. We need to look at the long-term factors. And I talked about popular capitalism. I mentioned the fact that we had the wider ownership of shares and council houses and all of that sort of stuff. Well, according to the three wise men on this one, they say maybe that's 1% to the Conservatives. What's much more significant is the fall in the in the working class. The Heath, Joel and Curtis reckon that there was a decrease of about from 60% or 51%, depending on how you measure it, down to 35%. And when that was translated into a vote based on established good voting trends, how many people actually got out and voted and which way they voted, then they reckon that was worth about a 9% swing in the vote. Five more, I think they say, to Labour, 4 fewer to the Conservatives. Now that is massive. That's a huge swing, about 9 percentage points. And so what we're seeing here is that while we have a lot of short-term factors going on, what's really happening here is that we're seeing a breakup of tribal voting. People are not voting the way they used to in terms of class. They're not saying, well, I am working class or I was working class, and therefore I'm going to vote in this particular way. I'm signed up to this ideological deal. What people were saying was, well, no, actually, I'm not like that anymore. I'm going to make a rational choice based upon what outcome is best for me. And I believe, based upon all of this, that my interests are better served by a Conservative government than by a Labour government. Some degree of strategic voting too, but I think the biggest issue is that polls fundamentally underestimated the way society had shifted, the way people's voting patterns had changed in response. One of the most interesting things here is that this was the first election in which we saw shy Tories. This was the idea that people were almost ashamed, particularly former, people who might previously have voted Labour, but obviously were no longer officially members of the working class. If somebody shoved a microphone in their face or asked them to sign a piece of paper, they'd say, of course I'm going to vote Labour. But when push came to shove, that rational choice came in. Here we see the conflict between tribal voting, which says you're going to vote Labour because you're formerly working class, and then your rational choice voting, which says, but now I'm a capitalist and I'm going to vote Conservative. So the shy Tories is where your tribal voting patterns overlap with your rational choice vote. That's one aspect of it. I think was also people were just convinced that Thatcher had been a very, very nasty with Thatcher, very, very divisive, and that had been an issue. And nothing that Labour did really convinced anyone to change their mind. Their campaign wasn't good enough. Again, maybe a point here and a point there. And it was only with fundamental repositioning, with ripping out the heart of Labour, creating new Labour, that Blair and his coterie were able to reposition the party such that it could start to rebuild its base and recruit new support. But that is what we're going to explore in 1997. And I can't believe I managed to get all the way around to that. So, hey, let's have a bit more House of Pain, and I'll see you in 1997. Okay, better back up, try and play the